right, so this is part 2 of the lesson plan lecture. So we talked in part 1 about the um, big questions that we have to ask, the main things that we need to know before we decide that we're going to give a lesson that day. What do we have to know? We have to know what material we're going to cover, and we have to know how are we going to cover the material. What strategy are we going to use? The next thing that we need to talk about is something called differentiated instruction. In other words, how are we going to make sure that all of our students have access to the lesson, have access to the material that's going to be covered? Differentiated means diversified or made unique for different students. So when we talk about differentiated instruction, we're talking about the process of making sure that each of our unique students, with all of their special needs and their individual interests and skills, are still getting out of the lesson what we want them to get out of it. And so here's what we need to ask. For this question, we need to ask, what are our students' learning styles and intelligences? We've talked about that, right? If you have most of your class is kinesthetic, then we need to think about how can we construct a lesson that's going to appeal to those kinesthetic learners. And then if we have some students that are visual or auditory, then we need to make sure that we have parts of the lesson that will appeal to them. The next question we need to ask is, what special needs do we have to meet, right? So we talked about different categories of special education, English language learners. We talked about barriers to learning, students who might have disabilities. They might have 504 plans, which dictate that they have accommodations that they need to be met. Like if you have a student with ADHD, there might be an accommodation on their 504 plan that says this student needs to be sitting in this location, or this student needs extra time with their lessons or with this or that. And then IEPs, again, that those determine for students who have a special education category, those determine what kinds of things they're going to be doing differently from their classmates. So if you have different students in your classroom with different needs, excuse me, my strep throat again is acting up. So if you have students with different needs in your classroom, then you need to think about that before you plan your lesson. How are you going to make sure that they get what they need? The next thing is if you have more boys than girls, there's evidence to suggest that boys sometimes, not all the time, but that boys tend to have slightly different modes of learning than girls do. Boys are more likely to be kinesthetic than girls, although there are definitely a lot of girls who are kinesthetic learners. Girls are it used to be that there was an assumption that girls were more likely to sit quietly and behave themselves, whereas boys were more likely to be active, and often there was an expectation that boys would cause disruptions in the classroom. Now, we found that assuming that, which is just frankly a false assumption, assuming that causes more harm than anything else because kids live up to the expectations that we have of them. But there are some differences between the ways that boys and girls learn sometimes, and it's important to take that into consideration. The other thing is, if you have high poverty in your classrooms, they're going to have a different background than your students who are more wealthy or affluent. They're going to have more technology at home. They're going to have more experiences outside of the classroom that they can draw from, and so that the affluent students are, rather. And so the way that you craft your lesson needs to take that into account. And then, there's even something like, what time of day does your class occur? Now, y'all know when you come in for first period or second period and you didn't get a good night's sleep the night before, y'all are sleepy. So if you have a first period class, then you might want to build activities into your lesson that encourage kids to wake up a little bit. Whereas if you have a class that's right after lunch or right before the end of the day, you might want to build activities that encourage calm and that encourage discipline a little bit more, because those are going to be the issues that you struggle with the most. I'm telling you this, those of you who want to be teachers, it's very often going to happen that you will be teaching the same subject. This is for mostly middle school and high school teachers I'm talking about. You'll have the same subject. Say you have 3 sections of English 1 or 3 sections of geometry. You might be teaching a totally different way in each of your 3 classes because you might have a completely different makeup of students and you might have a different time of day, and there's just so many different things that go into whether a classroom environment is going to be successful or not and what you need to do to ensure that the kids get the most that they can get out of it. Okay? So, have I made sure that all students can access the information that I need them to? All right? The next thing that we need to think about is what's going to happen after I teach the lesson? How am I going to make sure that the students have learned the material? Now, it's really easy to say, well, okay, I taught it, so clearly they learned it, right? No, not necessarily. You can give what you think of as the best lesson ever. You can plan it, you can have transitions in the middle of your classroom, you can have group activities, you can have independent writing assignments, you can have projects going on at different times. You can believe honestly that everything is going perfectly in your classroom. And then when it comes to that test at the end of the class, or that exit ticket or whatever you want to do, you can find that maybe about 70% of your students got it, but there were still 30% of them that didn't, or 20% of them, or 40, or whatever it is. So that's not necessarily, abnormal. It's just a question of, okay, how do I assess them? How do I see what they know and what they don't know? And then what do I do with that? So first of all, the question is, how will I make sure students have learned the material? There are a whole bunch of different ways that we can assess students. The one that you guys are probably the most comfortable with is what we call a forced choice quiz or test. Now, forced choice includes multiple choice, it includes matching, it includes whenever you have a word bank and they can choose a word to fit into the word bank. So a lot of your tests up until now have been multiple choice. And some of them in college will be as well, but not as many. Most of your tests in college are going to fit into some of these other categories. So you have a sheet in front of you now. It should be worksheet 2 that says what are the advantages and disadvantages of different assessment strategies. So this is where I need you to be filling in this right now. For multiple choice, the advantage is that it's easy to grade and it's usually a really good quick check of whether your students have a basic understanding of the topic if the questions are good. So that's the advantage to multiple choice. A lot of teachers use it, a lot of teachers swear by it. But there are some disadvantages to multiple choice. A lot of students say, why can't we just have multiple choice? Well, here's why. Multiple choice has a couple of flaws that can make it more difficult to have those types of tests. First of all, they're really hard to write, actually. To get a really good multiple choice test, now, it's really easy to pick the one correct answer when you're writing a set of answers, but to get good wrong answers that are going to make sure that the students really understand the material, it takes a long time actually, and a lot of teachers simply don't have the time to spend on writing really good multiple choice tests. The other disadvantage to multiple choice is that it's a forced choice. Students have the option to pick from something, so it's really tempting to just kind of select a random answer. And I have students do that sometimes. They just clearly didn't study and they pick a random answer. And it doesn't really show, it doesn't really fully show whether they understand the material. Sometimes it just shows that they were capable of picking the right answer out of a lineup. But that's not really demonstrating, as we'll see in the next set of PowerPoints, that's not really demonstrating full mastery of the material. It's just demonstrating recognition. All right, we have worksheets and homework. Worksheets and homework are good because, just like with multiple choice, they're really good quick assessments of what the students understand on a basic level. Okay? So those of you, I know some of you are doing the research paper on homework, so I'm kind of giving you a little bit of a boost on that one. Homework and worksheets, when they're done independently and when they're done after a lesson just to reinforce the material that you've just learned, they can help with that. But the disadvantage is that if a student doesn't understand the material, then you're going to be reinforcing a misunderstanding rather than reinforcing something that they do understand. So you have to design those types of assignments very carefully, and you also have to be wary of busy work because students can smell busy work from a mile away. Trust me, I've been there and I've learned that lesson. Okay. The next couple, we have essays, essay-based tests. I'm an English teacher, so I'm biased here, but I believe that essays, anything where you are writing out your ideas fully, in complete sentences, and you're being asked to really explain what it is that you've learned, I believe that is the best way for my content to assess the material. Now, it's not for every content. Obviously, science is going to have it a little different. You're not going to have a whole lot of essays in a math class. But for the humanities and social sciences, essays work really, really well because they allow students the opportunity to fully explain themselves. They also take a really long time to grade. And sometimes when you have students that are poor writers, it can be really difficult to help them improve and really knowing where to start. So they're harder to grade. It's not as hard to write as a multiple choice assessment, but they're harder to grade. Projects, a lot like essays. A project, is some visual manifestation or some maybe technological manifestation of what you've been learning. And just like essays, they are really, really good displays of what students have been doing in their classroom. But they're hard to grade, and I'm going to talk about projects, oral exams, or speeches and portfolios at the same time here. The advantage of all of those, again, is that they really show what you know as a student. The disadvantage of all of these is that they can be difficult to grade objectively. You usually are going to use a rubric and to check the boxes off in a rubric and say, well, this is a 5 out of 5, this is a 3 out of 5. And so rubrics can help with that, but they, essentially, your professors are generally going to know whether you got an A or a B. They're going to have a feel for what level of assignment that is. I think we talked about that the other day. So it might seem like there's not any objectivity in the grading. Now, standardized tests, they're everybody's, favorite thing. I know some of you are doing the research paper on standardized testing. The thing is, standardized testing are assessments that hold everybody to the same baseline. Everybody in South Carolina taking English 1 has to take the same standardized test. And so you really know whether those students have learned the content in their classes or not. But the disadvantage for standardized tests is that they take up a lot of class time and the teacher didn't create them, so it's really sometimes difficult to prepare students to excel on those tests without knowing exactly what's going to be covered. Okay? All right, last thing on this PowerPoint is what happens after I have assessed the learning. How am I going to plan my next lesson? And this is where data comes in. Data meaning information about how your students performed on their tests. So say you have 10 students and 7 of them do really well and 3 of them do really poorly. Well, you got to look at those 3 that did really poorly. Did they all do poorly on the same items? The same question? Everybody got number 7 wrong, and even some of the excellent students got number 7 wrong, in which case you might have a bad question on your hands. Or it might be that maybe you thought you covered the content in question number 7, but you didn't really cover it to the extent that you wanted to. So assessments, tests, essays, projects, whatever they are, assessments can tell you a lot about what the students know, but they can also tell you a lot about how you're doing as a teacher and what you need to be doing as the semester continues. What can I do next time to make sure that they get the material they need? Because you got to cover all the standards, right? So if you're not covering some of the standards, you might have to go back and redo. So that is lesson planning in a nutshell. The next presentation is going to be all about how to build good questions on tests and quizzes.